Ladies and gentlemen, please now welcome to the floor Stephanie Flanders, Senior Executive Editor at Bloomberg.
Thank you very much. I think we are set up to continue a fantastic conversation around geoeconomics and where we are in the world. This session is going to be talking about different perspectives on multilateralism, the future of multilateralism, if it has one, and I'm delighted that we have such eminent minds on this subject, eminent and influential minds on this subject, to discuss it with me. If you want to come to the stage, gentlemen, Jörg Kukies, State Secretary and a vital advisor on economic and financial affairs to the Chancellor here, and Daleep Singh, who I think is partly responsible for this conference in many ways. Things that he said a year ago inspired the subject, and indeed much of the discussion that the Atlantic Council has had on these subjects. But you're now, as of last year, Chief Global Economist and Head of Macro Research at PGIM, but of course before that, Deputy National Security Advisor in the White House. So I was looking. It's always good, just as an initial guide, to look at what you're supposed to be talking about, and then as a journalist think about how can I make that fit my own agenda. But I think where the Transatlantic Council wanted us to start is more or less where I would want to start, which is to think about not just American and German perspectives on multilateralism, but what it even means to those countries today, given what's happened in the last few years, particularly in the last year. As an economist who's worked in different parts of this topic, for a long time, multilateralism in the economic sphere was about getting people to park their political differences outside the room, forging common ground for easier flow of goods and capital around the world. And that was our model for economic multilateralism for a long time. Now the differences are in the room, at least when you look at the G20 summits of the last year or so, and often the multilateralism that's being discussed feels more about coalitions against rather than for. So, Jörg, if you'll forgive me, although you're from the host country, I wanted to actually ask Daleep, because you thought about this so much. For you, what is multilateralism today? And if you look at the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is it in a weaker or a stronger position than a few years ago?
Thank you, Stephanie, and good to be with you, Jörg. And thanks, everybody, for being here as well. There's just so much to say about this. I'll have to pick my spots. So, I think we're at a really delicate moment. You know, the world has become accustomed to the use of negative coercive devices more frequently and more potently than we've seen before. We know what those devices are: sanctions, export controls, tariffs, investment restrictions, and so on. But I am struck, with time and distance from my job in government, by the unfortunate reality that 2/3 of the world's population has not joined our sanctions coalition. As I've spoken to officials from those countries since I left, some voice concerns about efficacy of negative coercive devices. The spillovers exceed the benefits. Others, privately at least, push back on the legitimacy of using negative coercive devices, and they say it's an illegitimate exercise of brute economic force. So I think if we want to revitalize multilateralism, we've got to hear those concerns and reflect on them very carefully. We can't be defensive about it. We can't feel threatened by them. But it leads me to a belief that we have to achieve more balance in how we use multilateral gatherings and what message we're sending to third countries and the global south in particular. Because right now there is a perception that our statecraft of first resort are the types of devices that inflict economic pain and break economic linkages across the world. And there are a whole set of tools, and this is really what I was talking about last year, that can positively induce and attract countries through the prospect of mutual economic gain. Those are much harder tools to deploy. Often they require legislative authorities to appropriate money. And there may be, in many cases, tools that have yet to be invented, or we can reimagine existing ones or augment them. But that, I think, is, I mean, I'm not answering your question directly, but I'm saying I know the path towards a revitalized form of multilateralism. And it is in the use of these tools that can attract countries that right now are hedging their bets, and they're trying to carve out a non-aligned path. We have to offer to them the promise of these positive inducements, and they have to conclude that their strategic interests are still aligned with ours. I believe that's the case. We have to show it.
Your Kukies.
Well, I mean, I think my conclusion from the G20 summit is that it is a sign of strength of multilateralism, because the Indian presidency chose a different route than the Indonesian presidency, right? The Indonesian presidency was willing to accept split language and very skillfully crafted a text where there was a strong condemnation of the Russian war of aggression included, but it had the disclaimer, most countries in it. So Indonesia was willing to accept that. It became very visible in the statement that there were different views. That was also part of the statement, whereas the Indian presidency had a very different approach. The Indian presidency from the beginning said, we do not want most, many, some language in the text. We want a text that everyone can subscribe to. So in a way, that is a sign that there is an attempt to form more unity. And the fact that the final proposal was tabled by 4 emerging markets, Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, in that sequence the G20 presidencies, last year, this year, the next 2 years, is also a sign that the emerging economies have a different perspective of the way multilateralism should go. And in a way, it's also a strength, because if you look at the text and you look at the commitment that the G20 made, it is a very strong statement in favor of the core principles of the UN Charter. No gain of land by force, respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and therefore gave a very strong statement of those core principles that we all live for. Of course, that implicitly accepts that there is a different interpretation of how that pertains to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And there, Daleep's point, both in terms of the voting behavior in the UN General Assembly and the statements from the UN and the participation or not in sanctions has a divergence. But the fact that we all committed to these very strong core principles is something that eventually will help us in this process.
Can I say something about communiques and so forth, especially, I mean, this is really G20 versus G7, and I just don't think, there's no G20 communique that's going to obscure the fact that we've returned to a very intense period of great power competition in which 2 key members have expressed and revealed a desire to disrupt that order. There's no contortion of words that will obscure that reality. So
well, the comparison between last year's and this year's.
Well, there's that. That's fair. But, you know, I think to hope that G20 communiques are going to express moral clarity and we don't share the same values is going to be an elusive goal. But the G20 was originally founded to focus on areas of shared economic interest, and maybe that's where it can go, is to say, just like the World Bank and the IMF are trying to reorient their missions around global public goods, maybe the G20 can provide direction in that effort. The G7 is, I think, a totally, in other geometric shapes, other groupings, I think they're much better poised for action. And so I think that has big implications.
I guess, I mean, part of the issue here is the way that sort of emerging domestic agendas, particularly Bidenomics, is bleeding into this discussion. So there's the fact that different sides on the Ukraine dispute, or in their response to the Ukraine invasion, are represented in the G20 poses a particular problem to the G20. But there is a broader aspect, which actually I was struck by the German national security strategy that was published this summer. This passage. However, some states are increasingly putting the principles of free economic cooperation at risk and use their economic clout to advance their foreign and security policy agendas. And the risk is this will erode the international rules for open and fair markets and undermine a stable financial system. I mean, who is Germany thinking of in that context? And is the US the biggest threat currently to that approach?
I mean, I would say on the discussion in Germany around the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm sure that is exactly what you're getting at with your question, so we may as well name the elephant in the room if it's walking about so visibly. We have taken a quite differentiated stance, right? On the one side, of course, we voice this in all of our bilateral discussions, that we think localization of production rules are not in the interest of global free trade. However, on the other side, we also acknowledge that, first of all, it is extremely positive that the United States launches a program of several $100 billion that will help progress the cause of decarbonizing our economy and achieving climate neutrality, and therefore putting their money where their mouth is, right? Just like Europe is doing. And if I compare the economic size of the United States of America and the European Union, and if I compare the amount that the United States of America is spending to progress that aim through direct fiscal support of different industries, it's not like the sheer size of what the US is doing is larger than what the European Union is doing. I mean, this year alone, we just passed a budget where Germany next year will invest 112 billion euros into the decarbonization of our economy through support to citizens, through support to companies, through support to projects, which is pretty similar to what, in principle, the US is doing on the Inflation Reduction Act. So in that sense, given that we have the fiscal power and the fiscal willingness to do similar things in size as the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, and as I said, qualitatively, it's not that different, I think we shouldn't be too nervous about what the US is doing with the Inflation Reduction Act. I think Europe has to wake up, in a sense, to the policy design that the Inflation Reduction Act is making. Instead of the European approach, if you want a green technology supported, you have to make a proposal to the Commission vets it for a long period of time, the Commission asks you reams of folders of questions. Some companies have publicly stated that it takes them 1.5 years to get a decision. Contrary to that, the Inflation Reduction Act is the legal right of any company doing something. As one American CEO told me, it takes 1.5 years to get approval in an international project of common European interest, and 20 engineers and lawyers and accountants to go through the process. It takes 3 lawyers and 3 accountants 2 days to figure out what the cash flow is from an investment and production tax credit from the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's good that the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen in her State of the Union speech again acknowledged this problem, that the European Union in these things is just too slow and too cumbersome. So we're also learning from the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's a very long-winded answer to the elephant in the room question that was implicit in your quote.
I'm going to get a shorter answer to this, I hope, but I wanted to come back to you briefly. I mean, Germany's kind of sitting in the high ground on some of this, and indeed Chancellor Scholz was talking about being part of an endangered species as a free trader in New York this week. How does that square with the European Union's probe into unfair state subsidies on Chinese electric vehicles?
Well, I mean, I think it's very natural that if we are embracing the key elements of free trade, we all have to play by the rules. We have rules, the United States has rules, China has rules, everyone has rules, and it's perfectly normal, and we take note of the fact that the European Union has ground to do a study. That study has very high standards, so you can't just say they're doing this, they're doing that, and therefore we impose trade-related measures. As we've said publicly, the threshold of proof and of evidence is very high, and we now are going to follow the Commission and work with the Commission in that process of finding out whether there are undue subsidies or not.
But does it sort of remind us that the European Union itself is not necessarily fit for purpose when it comes to economic statecraft? There's an explicit division within the EU between national security objectives and economic objectives, which, as Daleep has reminded us, are now being brought together much more closely.
No, I wouldn't over-exaggerate this. I mean, the United States occasionally does anti-dumping surveys and studies and looks at whether there's things going on. The European Union, by the way, is not only in the area of cars, but also steel, is looking at various industry sectors, and I find that totally legitimate, just like other regions of the world also look at who sticks to the agreements and who doesn't stick to the agreements. So I seriously wouldn't read that much into the fact that we are verifying whether or not China sticks to the WTO rules on subsidies and distortions or not. I think it's much more important for the embracement of free trade that we move forward and move ahead on free trade agreements. And for example, the Chancellor, as we stated publicly after the meeting with President Lula, is very keen to finalize Mercosur by the end of this year. The Commission President said the same thing. We already moved ahead on Canada. We moved ahead with Kenya. We're moving ahead with Mexico, Australia, New Zealand. I would say less progress so far, but also a lot of hope on the free trade agreements of the European Union with India and Indonesia. All of those things are extremely positive. So I think the key part is that we expand what we didn't do for the last 10 years. We pick up on finalizing trade agreements. As President Lula said in our meeting, this has been going on for 20 years, the Mercosur, 20 years of Mercosur discussions. And if we get some of those agreements finalized, that would be a much, much bigger step. But of course, even if we finalize those agreements, occasionally there's going to be cases where both sides look, is the other side still playing by the rules? I think that's completely normal.
I mean, Daleep, I know I'm talking to Catherine Tai, a US trade representative, later today,
yeah.
And she will not give me a long list of trade agreements that she wants to push, because they've been quite explicit, the administration, about that not being high on the agenda at the moment. Can you see why people feel that the US has shifted from a sort of supporting free trade agreements for many years to economic statecraft, which feels more like strategic protectionism?
Sure, but to me, this is less of an ideological question. It's more empirical. I mean, if you ask anybody in this administration, are you in favor of free trade? The answer will be yes. We believe that competition induces productivity gains, and it is to the benefit of consumers and businesses and our productivity. But not all trade is good trade, and so that leads to a series of empirical questions that apply, I think, more generally to statecraft, whether they're coercive devices or positive ones. What are the tools we have at our disposal? What's the efficacy of the trade tools, for example, we have, their limitations, their spillovers, the historical experience? Because it's a multiplayer repeated game, if we enact this trade policy and our allies and our adversaries enact different ones, are we net better off? And are we net better off just in the aggregate sense, or the distributional consequences potentially negative and potentially very negative in certain concentrated areas? Those are all empirical questions, and so I think the discussion about whether the US is abandoning free trade principles gets lost in platitudes. And the real work of figuring out how we're going to reconstitute a global trade system is in spreadsheets, not words.
Okay, but it's also, as you said earlier, about a more naked power struggle which is becoming to the surface between China and the US. And that is a whole piece of this, which potentially you see in the BRICS expansion, which I know we wanted to talk about. So how do you see, economists have tended to kind of dismiss BRICS, and the bigger it gets and the more diverse it gets, the less seriously they take it. But the economists are not the ones making the decisions these days.
Sure. I mean, look, so I think the value of any multilateral organization or any organization is the group's impact greater than the sum of its parts. So by that metric, bigger is not necessarily better. The question is, can this bigger BRICS organization act as one? We know they're not bound together by any shared values, but do they share enough of the same interest to take collective action? The track record is poor. I mean, you can list the number of serious actions taken by the BRICS on a blank page. And then looking ahead, if you make the group bigger and they have more disparate voices, you're going to have more competing interests. So I don't know. If I'm being charitable, maybe there's a discussion, maybe there are actions they could take on oil markets, but that would just duplicate OPEC+.
They agree on one thing, which is that they are wanting to pose a threat to America's hegemony in the world.
Okay, sure. So that's the symbolism of this, and I don't mean to diminish the meaning of symbolism. I mean, there is a message here that is important, which is that by revealed preference, there's a large and growing number of countries that want to hedge against Western dominance of the global international order. So again, instead of reacting defensively or feeling threatened by it, it means we have to respond unsentimentally to identify and demonstrate why the strategic interests of these countries are still most closely aligned with ours. That should be our response. But in terms of what it does, really unclear to me. I mean, there may be a motivation shared by this grouping to create a rival architecture to the dollar-based financial system. But I think that's also just very hard to do without a bona fide currency, reserve currency. So I don't know. I'm left scratching my head as to what they're actually going to do.
They might come to the same conclusion. But your Kukies, when the Chancellor asks you, "What's my BRICS strategy?" does Germany even feel it needs a BRICS strategy?
Well, I think the reach out that the Chancellor has made to the entire global South, amongst them some of the BRICS, of course not in the BRICS, but he's traveled to Brazil, he's traveled to India, he's traveled to South Africa, he's traveled to several of the BRICS expansion countries, shows a clear sign that we don't believe it would be the right strategy to say, oh, they're now doing something else and let's not focus on them. Quite to the contrary. I think of all of the things that happened in Delhi, one of the most remarkable things is that one of the initiatives that Daleep co-founded, at least, namely the global initiative that we're doing on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, has now a tangible, hugely interesting, massively visionary project of establishing an infrastructure corridor from India to the Middle East to Europe. I mean, what could be more visionary than that, than building railroads from southern India to northern Europe, of building telecommunications cables, energy connections for the renewable energy exchange between the Middle East and the Indian continent and Europe. And all of this is also a very clear strategy, to work with a lot of the countries of the global South, including several of the countries that are in the BRICS Plus framework, but also, as we never say this is something against anyone, but of course we need to think about what has China done that we haven't done. And I do think this reach out to the global South in terms of doing projects together, working on infrastructure, is so mutually beneficial that, if anything, we need to do more and more of it. And I do think the fact that we now have several concrete projects is the right strategy. And we are doing the same thing when we traveled to Brazil and Chile and Argentina, when we travel to Africa, we're doing the same thing when we're doing the Compact with Africa meeting, which is an original G20 idea. We're doing the same thing of filling these acronyms and these words like Global Gateway and the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment with specific, tangible, job-creating, infrastructure-enhancing, climate neutrality enhancing specific billions and billions and hundreds of billions of investments, which will bring us closer to the global south.
But briefly, I mean, you mentioned about the scale. I mean, the relative scale of what's being talked about, for example, in expanding the World Bank's resources for catalyzing, we're talking tens of billions versus $1 trillion of Belt and Road lending over the last 10 years. And probably that same again in terms of the loans on commercial.
I'll tell you what's the difference. You don't want to know how many CEOs of German companies sent me text messages right after the announcement of the partnership with India and Saudi Arabia and the UAE to do infrastructure. And European, by the way, not only German, all saying, we can do this. We can help. What can we do? What does this mean specifically? Telecoms, energy, infrastructure, traffic. So the big lever that we have is, of course, that this will be a very strongly private sector crowding in type of initiative. So yes, we are enhancing the capital of the World Bank, and we need to do it. And the World Bank has an extremely strong new president who will also implement the qualitative reforms to deploy that capital more efficiently. But the point is, we will crowd in a huge amount of private capital to get from the tens of billions to the hundreds of billions to even more.
Can I jump in on this, Stephanie? Because I just want to say, I think the single most tangible demonstration effect we can have about our seriousness about positive economic statecraft is to deal with the festering debt crisis in the global south and Africa in particular, and it ties back to PGII. And so here's the backdrop. I mean, the IMF says most low-income countries are either in distress or near distress. They've all reached distress along different paths, but they share a few common factors that have very little to do with their own policy choices. The pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine and the impact on food and energy prices, climate shocks, surging interest rates, and China pulling back from lending to the region and also being unwilling to restructure its debt on comparable terms to other official creditors in a timely way. So that's the opportunity. And I think a grand bargain could be something along these lines. The G7 approaches debtor countries and says, above a certain threshold of your tax revenue, you should walk away from your obligations to repay China unless they agree to restructure their debt on comparable terms to other official creditors. That's number one. Number two, the IMF greenlights rescue programs that are right now being held up because of the intransigence of China to restructure its debt. It did this for Ukraine in 2015. The IMF should do for Africa what it's done for Ukraine. And three is what Jörg is talking about, what we worked on for the last 2 years, what I used to, which is tell debtor countries, if you walk away from your Chinese claims, which in many cases are, not in all cases, in many cases are extractive and opaque and coercive, we will backfill. We will provide credible financial assurances to backfill that financing at scale and with pace. And look, this is going to require new tools. This is the hard stuff. PGII is part of it. I think we could reimagine our sovereign loan guarantee program. I think we could reimagine the SPR so that it becomes a strategic resilience reserve. I think we should launch a sovereign wealth fund. There are lots of things we could do. But and then the World Bank would take a lot more risk, how it lends, where it lends, why it lends. That would move the needle.
Can we get a provisional yes from Germany on the first part here?
Well, I mean, as you know, we are working very closely on all of the issues
the debt
around debt and
walking away a bit beyond.
I mean, I think the one of the guiding principles is that the level playing field and the even negotiating on fair terms with the countries of the global south is a good thing. And I think we've managed now in the common framework with several countries already agreements that go in the direction of fairness. I mean, I'm and one of the most influential papers that I've read is How China Lends from the Peterson Institute and the Kiel Institute of Economics. And we use the empirical evidence in that paper and others that have come up so far to discuss with the countries, is what China is proposing to you on the surface really what's below the surface? So the increasing awareness to look at contractual obligations more holistically, I think, is a good development.
But Daleep is proposing also looking at the creditor side of this on the G7 side, which is not just about looking at the Chinese.
Yeah, but I think if the trend is that through one of the goals that we have, for example, in World Bank reform, is to be more forward-leaning on the projects that we finance and provide alternatives to other sources of capital, crowd in private capital. Like one of the questions that we constantly debate is, why is so much capital going into the Middle East for renewable energy? And why is so little, on a relative basis, going into the countries of Africa, that from a pure scientific basis have the same type of quality of solar energy and wind energy? And the reason is levelized cost of energy is driven a lot by cost of capital. And I think that is one of the key elements that we are following in terms of where can we help the projects that look to Africa as an example to invest. The other example that I want to give you that shows our policy is a project that we recently financed in Egypt, which is one of the largest industrial projects that this country has ever supported, namely the construction in Egypt of a completely new rail system from north to south, east to west in Egypt. Siemens won the contract, but it only won the contract, or it also won the contract, because we made the decision to use public support for financing, export guarantees, and the whole system that we have to win this deal. And I think too often we've been too shy about...
Is that equity and is that equity, Jörg, or is it debt?
It's mainly debt, financing. But the point is, in many or too many of these cases, whenever China was competing with us, we probably said, oh, not sure if we can win. Here we said, we want to win this deal. We want to help a German company win this deal. They will export a lot. It'll also be good for jobs in Germany. But we also want to make a statement that with these infrastructure investments, when we say partnership for global infrastructure investment, we mean partnership, and we also mean that we want to provide good and fair terms for a project where we also have sustainability rules and all of those things. So this example shows you that we are serious when we say that we want to
support
fill these ideas of global gateway and partnerships with life, and it's to the mutual benefit of our economies.
But I just think, there's so many countries that are drowning in debt, Stephanie, and this new form of financing is great, but can we not agree that above a certain percentage of tax revenue, let's say it's a third of your tax revenue, if China refuses to provide debt relief on comparable terms to other creditors, that you walk away and we will backfill? I think that's a commitment that we should eventually. I'm not putting Jörg on the spot. I mean, there's a lot, but that's what we should work towards.
But is that something that Germany would consider?
Well, as I said,
because it's very nice talking about exciting infrastructure future projects, but this is the legacies of past projects.
Yeah, but as I said, please look at what we've done in Chad, what we're doing in Sri Lanka, what we're doing in Zambia. In all of these cases, we are providing those countries with alternatives. And we're not just saying, okay, let's restructure and then walk away. We're crowding in the private sector. So the answer is, yes, we want a constructive and positive outcome to these negotiations. We're not going to say going forward in every negotiations we're going to behave this way or that way or that way, because as the current negotiations with Ghana show, every case is going to be different, right? So in that sense, I'm a little bit reluctant. That's why you're probably saying,
fair. I mean, the problem is,
you're dodging the bullet, but the fact that every case is different and individual, and also the terms at which the individual countries lend is different in country A, B, or C. I'm a bit averse to saying, like as a rule, we're always going to do the following in every single debt restructuring negotiation in the next 10 years.
The problem is, it's supposed to be a common framework.
Yeah, of course.
And
but you need flexibility.
Waiting,
but you need flexibility within the common framework.
Zambia's been waiting 2.5 years since they defaulted. They don't have an MOU.
I welcome the fact, as my old boss used to talk about committing substance, we've actually committing some substance at the end of this, trying to actually make some progress. Look, we've run out of time, but I did want to have one final question, because it is so topical and it's very relevant to the question of economic statecraft. Daleep, you've talked about needing a doctrine of economic statecraft, yes. And people have lots of discussions about what that means, whether we need it or whether we can just talk about existing rules. Within that doctrine, what's the appropriate thing to happen to the seized Russian sovereign assets?
You break a country, you should pay to remake it. They should transfer the assets, and if that's not legally feasible, then I favor a Brady bond type scheme where you put the assets up as collateral. It's risk-free collateral after all. And you use that collateral to induce the private sector to lend money at scale to Ukraine even as the war proceeds.
Your Kukies.
So obviously an enormously complex question in terms of the legal depth and implications. We're working very closely and fully with the European Commission to figure out what we can do. One of the ideas is that we work with the interest gained by the frozen assets, because usually the contractual terms is that they get credited zero. In fact, given that we've seen an increase in interest rates, there's room that we can work with. Freezing, legally speaking, is always easier than seizing. We know that. And how far we can go is really a legal question. And that's something that is far too complicated to go into the exact, because the work is still going on, conclusion, because it is work in progress, I would say. But I'm very confident that the European Commission, which is leading that discussion, and because it has to be a European legislation, of course, because the European Union took the decision to freeze, what we can do now to move economic benefits from the formal owners to Ukraine.
You could get something concrete on that in weeks, or are we talking?
I am not going to make a prediction on whether it's weeks or months, because, as I said, the legal questions are excruciatingly difficult. So, especially because if we establish precedent, we also have to be aware that whatever precedent we establish will have to be adhered to in the future. And since every case is different, that also means, like these impulses that you have, let's seize everything, instead of just freezing, in reality are much, much more complex than it sounds on the surface.
State Secretary Jörg Kukies, Daleep Singh, thank you so much. I think you guys have a brief break, and then